Alright guys, so I got a really interesting article here for y'all from Robert Pape in Foreign Affairs, where he basically outlines a position that I and many others have been giving for months now, which is that it is not possible for Israel to militarily eliminate Hamas inside of Gaza, which has been basically their primary goal from the beginning, since October 7th. And he goes on to say, not only are they not defeating Hamas, but they're actually making them stronger. In other words, Hamas is in a stronger position now than they were before October 7th, right? So let's go ahead and get into this. His title here is Hamas is Winning. Why Israel's failing strategy makes its enemy stronger. So he says 9 months of Israeli air and ground combat operations in Gaza have not defeated Hamas, nor is Israel close to vanquishing the terrorist group. To the contrary, according to the measures that matter, Hamas is stronger today than it was on October 7th. Since Hamas's horrific attack last October, Israel has invaded northern and southern Gaza with approximately 40,000 combat troops, forcibly displacing 80% of the population, and that's honestly an undercount from other estimations that I've seen. He says they've also killed over 37,000 people, which again I think is an undercount, but they've also dropped at least 70,000 tons of bombs on the territory, which, as he says here, surpasses the combined weight of the bombs dropped on London, Dresden, and Hamburg in all of World War II. And keep in mind, for a long time, Dresden was considered to be one of the most bombed out places on the face of the planet. And you can combine Dresden with London and Hamburg in all of World War II. And in this tiny 5 by 25 mile Gaza Strip, Israel has dropped more tons of bombs in the last 9 months. I mean, it's just unimaginable, the amount of death and destruction that has taken place. The idea that this was ever a targeted war against Hamas was always ridiculous, right? He says they've also destroyed or damaged over half of all of the buildings in Gaza and limited the territory's access to water, food, and electricity, leaving the entire population on the brink of famine. And we've also already, at this point, had dozens of examples, that I've seen at least, of people who have died from starvation inside of Gaza. And that is because of a intentionally man-made famine by Israel restricting the aid from getting into Gaza and also killing the Gazan police forces that are supposed to help guard and secure the safe delivery of aid. They've targeted, obviously, directly aid workers themselves, like with the World Central Kitchen strike, where they not once, not twice, but 3 separate times drone striked aid convoys that were inside of Gaza. I mean, we've seen this over and over and over again with the Flower Massacre as well, where they killed and wounded hundreds of people who were desperately trying to go get access to aid. I mean, all of this has been a war of on the entire population of Gaza from the beginning. And it's not as if this was a secret. I mean, right after October 7th, you had top Israeli military and political leaders who openly said, we're going to do a complete siege. We're going to cut off the food, the water, the electricity, right? There are no innocent civilians inside of Gaza, right? With Benjamin Netanyahu citing Amalek, the biblical story of Amalek, to kill the men, the women, the children, the ox, the camel, the sheep, whatever else. This was the most clear genocidal intention that I think has ever taken place in world history. But he continues here. He says, although many observers have highlighted the immorality of Israel's conduct, Israeli leaders have consistently claimed that the goal of defeating Hamas and weakening its ability to launch new attacks against Israeli civilians must take precedence over any concern about Palestinian lives. In other words, they view Israeli lives as more valuable than Palestinian lives. Pretty clear. The punishment of the population of Gaza must be accepted as necessary to destroy the power of Hamas. And this is something we've heard not just from top Israeli leaders, but also from US politicians and media figures as well, right? Well, I may not like the fact that there are so many civilians being killed, but what are you going to do? War is terrible, and you got to defeat Hamas. Well, if defeating Hamas is not on the table, so then what has all of this been about? What's the excuse now? Because they're not going to defeat Hamas. And this is something that we even saw admitted just last week, I believe it was, from the IDF spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, who said anybody who's telling you that we're going to militarily eliminate Hamas is lying. So if that's taken off the table, if you're not going to eliminate Hamas, then what are you still doing in Gaza other than making life impossible for the people who live there? He continues, though. He says, but thanks to the Israeli assault, Hamas's power is actually growing, just as the Viet Cong grew stronger during the massive search and destroy operations that ravaged much of South Vietnam in 1966 and 67, when the United States poured troops into the country in an ultimately futile bid to turn the war in its favor. Hamas remains intractable and has evolved into a tenacious and deadly guerrilla force inside of Gaza, with the lethal operations restarting in the northern regions that were supposedly cleared by Israel only a few months ago. So, part of the justification for going into Rafah was to say, oh, this is the last bastion of Hamas, and we just need to go into Rafah and we'll be able to finish the job. Well, that's complete bullshit, because as soon as you guys start to remove yourselves from the northern portions of Gaza, Hamas has been coming back in, and they've been occupying that space. Hamas is still in control of a massive portion of Gaza. So, basically what this has turned into is like exactly what it was in Vietnam for the United States. The reality of this is just, you are never, as an occupying power, as an imperial force, or whatever you want to say, as a more advanced military apparatus, you are just never going to be able to defeat a guerrilla fighting force that is embedded in the population, that to a large extent, as he points out in this article, is still supported by the population. You are never going to win that war. You're not. And he's going to go on to explain how the carnage inside of Gaza that Israel has leveled against the civilian population, to the point now where a majority of the population has had at least one family member who has been killed or injured by Israel. It's like, what do you think that's going to do? Do you think that's going to turn them against Hamas, or do you think that's going to turn them against the people who are killing their family and blowing up their house? You can't just go and indiscriminately level the entirety of some place, leave people with absolutely nothing to look forward to nothing to hope for, and then expect that that's going to what? Turn them to your side? That's going to produce long-term peace and security? No, I mean, it's the opposite. It's going to bolster support for Hamas, because Hamas is the only fighting force that is fighting against the people who are massacring your family and blowing up your house. It's really not that complicated, guys. We've seen this play out, as he pointed out there, in Vietnam. We saw this play out in Afghanistan. We've seen this play out time and time again. It doesn't matter if you have such a more advanced military apparatus, or your troops are better armed, or they're better trained, or whatever the case may be. You're just not going to win in this kind of situation. Now he continues. He says the central flaw in Israel's strategy is not a failure of tactics or the imposition of constraints on military force, as if they've had any constraints on military force. Just as the failure of the U.S. military strategy in Vietnam had little to do with the technical proficiency of its troops or the political and moral limits on the uses of military power. Rather, the overarching failure has been a gross misunderstanding of the sources of Hamas's power. To its great detriment, Israel has failed to realize that the carnage and devastation it has unleashed in Gaza has only made its enemy stronger. And again, no shit. Anybody who has any sort of understanding of the last 100 years of these kinds of wars would understand that. So the reality, unfortunately, is just that this was never a targeted war to eliminate Hamas or to get the hostages back or produce long-term security. It was never any of those things. It was always just a revenge tour to go inflict as much punishment on the civilian population in Gaza as they could get away with. So you failed in terms of eliminating Hamas militarily. You failed in terms of getting your own hostages back, because you've killed more of them through military means than you have rescued. The only bulk of the hostages that were returned to Israel were through that temporary ceasefire back in November. So you failed on those two fronts, but you've also in the meantime managed to isolate your own country, your own government, on the world stage. I mean, guys, it's only a handful of countries that are still standing with Israel right now. Even, U.S. allies like Canada and many other Western European governments are starting to turn on Israel, right? They're cutting off, weapon shipments. In some cases, they're imposing sanctions on like West Bank settlers or whatever the case may be. Some of them are going out of their way to recognize a Palestinian state. The only major country that is still firmly behind Israel with everything they want to do is really just like the United States, and maybe you could throw in Germany and the UK maybe. But the entire rest of the world is turning against Israel. You're isolating yourselves to the point where this is not going to be sustainable even for you. Like, even adopting the Israeli perspective to try to give an analysis of all of this, this has been a complete failure from top to bottom. This isn't even good for the government of Israel. The only thing it's good for is for Benjamin Netanyahu as an individual person, because he wants to keep himself in power, right? Because he knows the second this war ends or there's a ceasefire, whatever the case may be, he'll likely be forced out of power. There will be elections. He'll be removed. And then he may actually go to jail because of the corruption charges that he's facing in Israel. So the only person that this continuation of this genocide actually benefits is Benjamin Netanyahu as an individual. And it's unfortunate because the Joe Biden administration, even though they preach about disagreements they have with Israel and, oh, we're going to do this and that, the reality is Joe Biden has effectively sent our entire foreign policy in the region over to be in the hands of Benjamin Netanyahu. But he continues here in this article. He says, Hamas is now waging a guerrilla war involving ambushes and improvised bombs, often made from unexploded ordnances or captured IDF weapons, and protracted operations that the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's national security advisor recently said could last through the end of 2024 at least, which is completely insane. They say Hamas could still strike in Israel. They likely still have some 15,000 mobilized fighters, roughly 10 times the number of fighters who carried out October 7th. And further, more than 80% of the group's underground tunnel network remains usable for planning, storing weapons, and evading Israeli surveillance, capture, and attacks. Most of Hamas's top leadership in Gaza remains intact. And so in sum, Israel's fast-moving offensive in the fall has given way to a grinding war of attrition that would leave Hamas with the ability to attack Israeli civilians, even if the IDF presses ahead with its campaign in southern Gaza. Who could have predicted this? Who could have predicted this? Other than, again, anybody who has paid attention over the last 40-some-odd years of these kinds of conflicts, right? This should not be surprising to anybody. This should not be surprising to anybody. I mean, 80% of the tunnel network still involved. How many times have we seen the military of Israel, the government of Israel, make the excuse when they bomb some refugee camp or mosque or school or whatever the case may be? They'll come out and they'll say, well, we had to use these 2,000-pound bombs to, drop on this refugee camp because we needed to target the tunnel system beneath this refugee camp. 80% of the tunnel system is still in place. 80%. We are 9 months into this genocide. They're nowhere close to defeating Hamas. Nowhere remotely close. Now, he continues. He says failed counterinsurgencies in the past, often fixated on enemy body counts. The IDF is now engaged in a familiar game of whack-a-mole that bogged down the U.S. troops in Afghanistan for years. Slavish attention to body counts tends to confuse tactical and strategic success and ignores the key measures that would show whether the strategic power of the opponent is growing even as the group's immediate losses mount. For a terrorist or insurgent group like Hamas, the key source of power is not the size of its current generation of fighters, but its potential to gain supporters from the local community in the future. And again, that shouldn't be surprising to anybody, right? Of course, I've covered this story before. We saw that reporting from Politico, for example, right? That also confirmed that a large amount of the tunnel network is still intact. They also confirmed that potentially thousands of new recruits have joined Hamas since October 7th. So at this point, the claims from Israel in terms of the amount of Hamas militants killed is somewhere at 15,000, which I think is totally ridiculous. They basically include any, semi-adult male to be a Hamas militant that they kill. The estimations from Hamas are closer to 7,000 or 8,000. The estimations from the US are closer to 10,000. So, I would believe that maybe they've killed 10,000 Hamas militants or so, but you started off with 30 to 40,000 Hamas militants pre-October 7th. Those were Israel's own estimates. So if you started off with that, and then in the meantime, in the last 8-9 months of this, Hamas has managed to gain potentially thousands of fighters to their ranks, then what are we left with? I mean, we're left with maybe, in the net, you've taken out close to maybe a fourth of their fighting force. We're 9 months into this. How long is this supposed to go on? How long is this supposed to go on? We already have, as he pointed out there, the entirety of the population on the brink of famine, if not already undergoing famine-like conditions. We already have people who are starving to death. We already have the entire population that has been displaced, right? They've destroyed a majority of the fucking standing structures inside of Gaza. How much more damage, how much more death and destruction could you possibly level against the Gaza Strip, while simultaneously not even being remotely close to defeating Hamas? So again, the question there is, so what are you guys actually doing in Gaza? what are you doing in Gaza? If it's not to eliminate Hamas, because clearly you're failing on that front, so what exactly are you doing other than making life impossible? And that's exactly what their goal was from the beginning, right? Now, we move on, because there are a couple other things here that I want to mention before I finish off this video here. So here is pointed out by Prem of The Intercept, our boy Prem. The latest on a new amendment that was put forward in the House of Representatives. I mean, this is just a perfect example, to me at least, of, a question that I keep asking myself on like a daily basis at this point of how low can our government possibly go? Not only is it enough that we are fully complicit in this genocide, we're giving them the weapons, we're giving them the diplomatic cover, etc., but now we're actually going out of our way to do basically just full-blown genocide denial. So here's his headline: 62 Democrats joined 207 Republicans in a vote to conceal the Gaza death toll. Now, the actual amendment that he's referring to here says this: none of the funds appropriated by this act, and this is apparently like a general appropriations bill, so they're adding this amendment to that bill that's likely to get passed. So none of the funds appropriated by this act may be made available for the State Department to cite statistics obtained from the Gaza Health Ministry. So at this point, it's like we've moved on again from just being fully complicit in arming and funding this genocide. We are now in the stage of genocide denial, where we're going to say the State Department is not allowed to cite the Gaza Ministry of Health, which, by the way, throughout previous conflicts, has been proven time and time again to be extremely reliable in their estimations. And honestly, I think, and many other experts think, that the numbers coming out from the Gaza Ministry of Health, if anything, are probably a drastic undercount of the amount of deaths and casualties that have taken place inside of Gaza. But here you have the U.S. House of Representatives, Democrats and Republicans. I mean, it's a majority Republicans, but also, again, you had many Democrats who sided with them, saying, we don't want the U.S. government to even be able to cite the Gaza Ministry of Health. Keeping in mind that Israel has intentionally and repeatedly attacked all other potential aid sources or other organizations on the ground who could potentially give an estimate in this kind of situation. I mean, what do you even say at this point? What do you even say at this point to something like this? I mean, it is a new low every single day that this goes on. Now, to make this explicitly clear here for everybody, this was one of the, I guess, sort of like, advices that went out from the Democratic Party. They typically do this kind of thing when there's a major bill coming up, where they'll give advice on what the party line is to vote yes or no on any given amendment, because there's a lot of amendments and it can get kind of complicated. And so, I mean, you can see here with a lot of these amendments, it's very clearly the position of the Democratic Party to vote no, right? Vote no on, it looks like Marjorie Taylor Greene's amendment here to prohibit funding for Ukraine. This one prohibits funding for USAID. They're saying vote no, vote no, vote no, vote no. And then you get down here to the Moskowitz amendment, the one we just looked at, prohibiting the appropriation by this act to be made available to the State Department to cite the statistics from the Gaza Ministry of Health. And the official Democratic Party position is no recommendation. No recommendation. I mean, seriously, guys. What are we supposed to take away from this? This is the official Democratic Party position, that the State Department should not even be able to look at the Gaza Ministry of Health numbers. I mean, it's just, it's beyond sick. There are no words. Like, I literally cannot come up with words to describe how disgusted this makes me feel towards my own government. Now, we move on because we have a couple other things that I wanted to get to here real quick. Here from Adam Johnson and Brianna Rosen. So, if you guys remember, I think it was a couple weeks ago at this point, Benjamin Netanyahu came out and he posted a video in English, specifically for an American audience, where he was attacking Joe Biden, saying, you're holding up weapon shipments to Israel, you're not allowing us to finish the job, whatever else. And what he was referencing was one arms shipment that wasn't canceled, it wasn't blocked, it was just sort of like stalled by the Biden administration. And it was an arms shipment for 2,000-pound bombs that were to be sent to Israel. Now keep in mind, 2,000-pound bombs have a lethal radius of up to 1,000 feet. It is physically impossible to use these bombs in a place like Gaza without it absolutely involving the countless deaths and destruction of civilian life. So these are weapons that never should have been used in Gaza in the first place. The Biden administration basically slow walks one delivery of these weapons, Bibi freaks out. He posts a video online attacking Biden over this. And instead of trying to put Benjamin Netanyahu in his place, instead of trying to check him, and to, I mean, let's be honest here, guys, just say, who the fuck is a superpower here? I believe it was Bill Clinton, right, who said this back in the day when he was being antagonized by an Israeli prime minister, and he got off the phone and he said, who the fuck is a superpower in this relationship? But instead of doing that, Biden basically bent over, he bent the knee to Benjamin Netanyahu. So here from Brianna Rosen, she says, quote, U.S. officials went line by line through the arms shipments to Israel to rebut Netanyahu's delay claim. So not only are we not delaying the weapons, we're not halting the weapons, we're not preventing the weapons from going over to be complicit in this genocide, but we're going out of our way after Benjamin Netanyahu, who, by the way, wants Trump to be the president. He doesn't want Biden in there because Biden plays this game of pretending to care about Palestinian civilians and whatever, drawing fake red lines and whatever else. Trump won't even bother with that kind of bullshit. So he wants Trump to be the president. And so he attacks Biden, and Biden's response is not to attack him back, not to make any sort of public pronouncement or statement against Benjamin Netanyahu, but it's instead to basically say, please don't get mad at us. I promise we're not holding up any of the weapons. I promise you. Look, we went line by line. We checked everything. We're getting everything to you that you could possibly imagine. Like, are you fucking kidding me? How pathetic is this? How pathetic is this? We went line by line to make sure that Netanyahu knows that we would never dare to hold up any weapon shipments, keeping in mind that these U.S. weapon shipments to Israel are totally illegal under international law, but also under U.S. law through the Leahy Law, the Foreign Assistance Act. We've been over this a million times at this point. These weapon shipments are illegal. They're illegal. Now, the way that they get around that is the State Department pretends as if there are no credible allegations of war crimes committed by Israel inside of Gaza with these weapons. Even though we know it was a U.S. weapon that was used in that Rafah strike on a refugee camp that killed dozens of innocent people, they just pretend as if none of this exists, right? Israel has never done any wrongdoing. And so these weapon shipments are perfectly fine. And we would never dare to question any of them. And as pointed out here by Adam Johnson, you look at the statistics. This was a report by CNN. There has been 68 different weapon shipments from U.S. Air Force's bases to Israel since October, right? Which averages out to about one every 4 days. One every 4 days. And I'm supposed to believe that Joe Biden is like desperately concerned about the civilian death toll in Gaza. If you actually had any red lines, if you actually had, a single shit to give about the Palestinian civilians that are being massacred with the weapons you're sending to Israel, then you would cut the weapons off. You wouldn't be sending one weapon shipment every 4 days. Every 4 days for 9 months straight. Think about the scale of that. And also think about, towards the beginning of this, after October 7th, one of the main arguments I heard in pushback to what I and many others were saying, which was to cut off the weapons to Israel, is people would say, oh, well, the U.S. weapons aren't really that important, and Israel would be able to continue this regardless of whether or not we were sending them weapons, so that's not really a fight that you should pick. If that was the case, then why are we sending them weapons every 4 days? Why have we been sending them weapons every 4 days over the last 8-9 months straight? Clearly they need these weapons. Clearly this is a massive point of leverage for the Biden administration to use over Israel. He's just refusing to use that leverage. It's as simple as that. Now, a couple more things. This may be a new low, even from the previous new low that I covered earlier in this video. Hear from our boy Prem Deker. So, one of the main arguments when you watch these State Department briefings that you hear from State Department ghouls like Matthew Miller and John Kirby, the rest of these guys, is they'll say, oh, well, Israel is doing thorough investigations and we anticipate that they're going to get back to us soon with some new information and some conclusions to their investigations. And something that Prem has been really on top of over the last number of months has been the cold-blooded murder of Hind Rajab, a sweet, adorable, I believe she was 6 years old. She was killed with her family in a car inside of Gaza. And it was a unique scenario because we actually had the phone calls where she was calling the Red Crescent and was begging for help. And you can see some of the quotes here. She said they are dead, talking about her family members who were killed right in front of her. She said, quote, the tank is next to me, the Israeli tank. Hamas does not have tanks, so there's only one source of the tank here in this conversation. She says, it's almost night, I am scared. Come get me, please. I mean, if you guys want to make yourselves cry, Go and listen to these tapes. This was one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever heard in my entire life, was the calls made by Hind Rajab. So she's saying, it's almost night, I'm scared, please come and get me. She's begging for help, right? So he's been asking the State Department about this situation for months now. And every single time he gets the same response. Well, Israel is investigating. I'm sure they're on top of this, right? We trust them. They're going to be neutral, etc., etc. And so he starts off here. He says, yesterday, the U.S. echoed Israel's claim that the Red Crescent didn't comply with Israel's investigation into the killing of Hind Rajab. So Prem asked if the U.S. verified the claim from Israel. Of course, they said no. No need to verify. And so he asked the Red Crescent, and they said that Israel never reached out for any additional information. Now he continues, saying that yesterday we asked the State Department about the killing of Hind Rajab. Their update, 147 days later, was simply, quote, Israel says there weren't any tanks in the area. There weren't any tanks in the area. Huh. That's weird because, as he points out here, we've seen investigations from the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, Forensic Architecture, and Hind Rajab herself in these phone calls, who directly referenced Israeli tanks. Right? This is as close to 100% definitive certainty as you could possibly get. And the official U.S. State Department position is, well, Israel said there were no tanks there, so we trust them. No need for any further conversation about it. Even though Israel said they were investigating this, and then the Red Crescent said they never reached out for any further information or anything like that. So this is where we're at. We have a government now, right? This is not the Trump administration, which obviously lied all the fucking time, constantly. This is the Biden administration. They're supposed to be better than this. They're supposed to be above the chaos, right? This is the most ridiculous lie that I've ever heard in my life. You're saying you believe at face value the Israeli claim that, oh, there were no tanks in the area, even though the child who was killed on this phone call referenced the tanks in front of her. Who am I supposed to believe? Am I supposed to believe the Israeli government? Or am I supposed to believe direct witness testimony from the fucking person who was killed? Right? And other forensic investigations that were done about this kind of a war crime. Who am I supposed to believe? You're going to believe the Israeli government or your lying eyes? That's what they expect from us at this point. One final thing. Because, of course, we have yet another directed mission of genocidal intent here from an IDF soldier operating inside of Rafah in Gaza right now, as pointed out by Yunus Tirawi. And this is based on a public Facebook post that this motherfucker put online. And he says this: we really are flattening Gaza. There has never been such destruction. I am glad about it. This is more than the Nakba that we did to them in 1948. For every one of ours, 1,000 of theirs will go. Listen, guys, this is hands down the most obvious genocide that has ever taken place on the face of the planet. It's not even close. We have heard statements from Israeli soldiers, statements from Israeli military leaders, political leaders. This has been the most open genocide that has ever been, that has ever occurred in history. Usually, when you have we have the ongoing ICJ case that's being brought against Israel, usually the most difficult part to prove when you're trying to prove a genocide case is the intent aspect of it. With this, it's really easy. It's really easy. You have statement after statement after statement, followed through by action after action after action, doing exactly what they said they were going to do. It's like every day. I can't even show you guys the amount of public social media posts that I see from IDF soldiers on the ground, laying out explicitly their genocidal intent. This isn't up in the air. This isn't controversial to say this. This is a fucking genocide. Of course it is. They're not defeating Hamas. They're not rescuing their hostages. So what are they doing other than obliterating life in Gaza? They cut off the food. They cut off the water. They cut off the electricity. They bombed it into oblivion to the point where they've dropped more tonnage on this 5 by 25 mile area than was dropped on London, Hamburg, and Dresden combined in all of World War II, some of the most bombed out places in history. They've dropped more tonnage on the tiny Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated places on the face of the planet, where half the population is children. They've somehow managed to outpace every other historical comparison that you could make. They've killed over 15,000 children. They've killed over 37,000 people. They've utterly failed in militarily defeating or eliminating Hamas. They're nowhere close to that. So by what metric is this a success? The only metric that this is a success is if the goal from the outset, which it was, is to again destroy life in Gaza. That's the only metric by which they have succeeded.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying